It's weighing in, NJ.com's high school wrestling podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Weighing In, NJ.com's high school wrestling podcast, episode 4 of the 2025-2026 season. I'm your host, Bob Adders, alongside fellow NJ.com wrestling reporters, Joe Zedalis, Ryan Patti, and Jake Aferiat. So, as always, a lot going on in the world of New Jersey high school wrestling. Bunch to get to, recapping some of last week's stuff, some big county and conference tournaments, some top 20 teams remaining undefeated. We had some key results between top 20 teams in a big quad we're going to get to. A fresh top 20 dropped, as always. We'll break down some of the movers and shakers there, as well as in the individual ranks. Some loaded weight classes we're excited to touch on. Wrestlers who impressed us this week, several standouts we will give flowers to. And then, of course, we'll look ahead to some big tournaments coming up this weekend. So, gentlemen, the first full week of wrestling in January, and we know when we turn the calendar to the new year, it's dual meet heavy, and you know that's the bulk of what's been going on this week. But there was a big county conference tournament this weekend out there at Phillipsburg, and that was the Hunterdon Warren Sussex tournament. Ryan, you were there. Jake, that's a bunch of your wrestlers in that area, and definitely a little bit of a new flavor there. Some unexpected wins from wrestlers, and we had a new team champ as well. So Ryan, a lot going on out of Ep5 last weekend, and you were there to take it all in.
Yeah, I mean, how about North Hunterdon, guys? First team title at HWS since 2020. They haven't really started the year how they wanted to. They started 4-6. Obviously, a very tough schedule they wrestled, but I know they took that loss at Ep5 pretty hard. That was on Wednesday, so when you hear this podcast, this will run on Thursday. 8 days ago, they lost to Ep5 in Ep5, and this was a victory, even though it's not a dual victory, but a victory in a team title that they felt they needed. Aiden Yaruzzi was the MOW, and he was the MOW by a wide stretch. He beat Dalton Weber in the 132-pound final. Weber majored him last year in the 132-pound final, 8-5. And I remember talking to Mike Weilman from Open Mic, and we picked the MOW every year. And I was like, listen, and this was before the finals. I'm like, Yaruzzi's wrestling well enough right now where he can beat Weber. And even though, the outcome last year was pretty widespread, I just felt Yaruzzi was wrestling well enough coming into that match where I'm like, you know what, something could happen here. And something did happen. He beat him. Caden Wadle won a title at 106. Owen Fall looked outstanding at 113. Dave Bell, very happy with Owen Fall. Reed Busby, he's ranked for us at 126. He won a title. And then you had Kieran Raley, Owen Dandio made finals. And Dave Bell right now just has this team in a really good spot despite the 4-6 record. And before the season, I felt Mount Olive was the team to beat in Group 4. But you know what? After seeing Ep5, after seeing North Hunterdon, I'm going to say not so fast. And I've yet to see Mount Olive in person. I'm going to see them soon. But listen, I think it's completely up for grabs there. And briefly, before I kick it over to Jake, want to mention Vernon a little bit here. They got their first champion in True D. Giuseppe, 190-pounder. I talked to Billy Talmadge, who it feels like just a couple years ago I was talking to him when he was a wrestler at High Point. That's how fast time flies. He's a first-year head coach there, and they really love what D. Giuseppe has shown, in his senior year to start the season. I believe he's undefeated. He's kind of making waves at 190 where he's becoming a guy to watch throughout the state at 190. Obviously a very talented weight, but who knows what could happen later in the season. So, Jake, when we talked right after the tournament, you mentioned a couple of Del Val kids you were impressed with, obviously Ep5. What'd you make of what happened there?
Yeah. So, I think, again, the thing about North Hunterdon is, they've had high finishes the last few years, but have been shut out from getting atop the medal stand too. I think the 3 or 4 champs they had this year were their first champs in like 2 years, and they still managed top 2-3 finishes in every tournament. So, I think clearly it shows they've jumped levels. Del Val, I think, to me, I'm not going to say they were the team of the tournament because obviously they didn't win, but they had 2 champs for the first time since 2012 in Michael Hassan and Hunter Tefera. And the thing for me that always stands out about Galval is, yes, they're a Group 1 school, but I think if you ask any of us, we'll say they are maybe the preeminent Group 1 school that punches above its weight. No disrespect to Paulsboro, any of the other, South Jersey, Central Jersey Group 1 schools, but they're in a conference, in a division, in a county with a lot of Group 4 and Group 5 teams, a lot of whom they have no trouble beating. I mean, they've beaten Phillipsburg recently, they've beaten North Hunterdon recently, and been competitive in duels against those teams when they lose. And so, they're 10-0 right now. They're wrestling really well. I think they have 8 or 9 wrestlers with double-digit wins. So that is a pretty complete team. And, obviously tournaments aren't the be-all, end-all, and it doesn't, always translate one-to-one tournament success versus, how would you fare in a dual meet against this team? But listen, they took 3rd this year behind North Hunterdon and Phillipsburg. It's their 2nd top 3 finish in 3 years. So, if you, it's hard not to like and not be impressed by what, Andy Fitz does year after year with what has become one of the state's, maybe the preeminent small school program in the last, 4 or 5 years.
And elsewhere, we had a really big quad featuring 3 top 20 teams in the state. You had number 8 Paramus Catholic, number 9 Delsea, number 11 St. Joseph Metuchen, and also DePaul in there. And the big winner coming out of that, that was the Paladins of Paramus Catholic. A really impressive showing. They sweep the quad, including the victory over the 4-time defending Group 3 champion Crusaders of Delsea. Ryan, you've been talking about Paramus Catholic since early in the season and the potential that this group has, and they are wrestling at a very high level right now. Not a lot of holes in the lineup. And, they continue to churn out some really quality wins as we're getting into the second week of January.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not all that surprised. You saw glimpses at the Pope John quad, even though they did lose by a big margin to Camden Catholic, maybe a little bigger than they would have wanted. But look good against Pope John, look good against Bosco. The thing that I take from this match against Delsea, you did have Amari Van beat Nicky Polito to get ranked for us, and I know Bill loves Amari Van, and he's a kid that we wanted to get in the first individual rankings, but there wasn't really a spot for him because of some head-to-heads, because of some criteria that Van doesn't have. But this was a big win for Van. I'm not all that surprised, though. I would have pegged Paramus Catholic as a winner over Delsea. You mentioned not having a lot of holes, Bob. You really saw the depth of Paramus Catholic here at this quad. Guys like Guy Olsner, who I've mentioned. He's a state blood rounder. Joey Polici, a beast medalist, another state blood rounder. He's now ranked for us at 126 because of the job he did at this quad. He beat Dante DePaul, I believe, 4-0. Really looked good. He's a really tough kid to score on, and really only Cam Sons has scored on him this year, in a big way. And I think actually Polici got a takedown against Sons in that match. I think it was 20-9 in the Cali final. But Nicky Barone, Isaiah Rodriguez at heavyweights looked really good. So this Paramus Catholic team, I'm not all that surprised with what they did. That's the type of team they have this year. Jake, you were there. You got to see your team in St. Joe's met. I believe DePaul was the other team that was there, if I'm not mistaken. What'd you make of what you saw there? I think it was also the second time you saw DePaul this year, right?
No, it was the first. But, I think for me, just going back to PC for a second, the thing that impressed me is, the fact that they were able to win while having, like you said, while having Barone lose and while having, or Polici lose and while having C. Chibler, who was a state finalist, lose. I mean, those were 2 swing bouts that, I don't know if Delsea thought they were going to get on paper or if they had circled as toss-ups, but certainly, when you can beat kids of that caliber, that gives you confidence. And, for me, the thing that stood out is the depth that you mentioned, Ryan, and just how, how complete kind of this team is. John Piella, longtime coach of the Paladins, told me afterward that was maybe one of the most encouraging things is, he had 2 of his hammers lose and he had other guys step up, whether it was in the lower weights, whether it was, in the middle weights, kind of all throughout the lineup. Guys just did their job. And, I asked him too, I said, did he ever consider bumping guys up and moving guys away to get more favorable matchups? And he said, honestly, that's not something they do. He said, they've done it in the past. It doesn't always work and it doesn't really suit them. So, they weren't afraid to get, their best kids on Delsea's best kids and kind of let the chips fall where they may. And so I think that was encouraging. But again, Delsea's been the cream of the crop, one of the best public schools, 4-time defending state champs for a reason. They wrestled St. Joe's Metuchen well and tough. And, they wrestled, obviously, DePaul tough. And, I think St. Joe's Metuchen, too, they came out of there. The only team that they beat in that quad was DePaul. But, they had some big individual wins, too, in some of the bouts, whether it was Nico Dorado at 120, Tyler Whitford bumping up a weight and beating a kid in Guy Olsner on Paramus Catholic to try to, get some points there. So, I think there's a lot if you're, coach of these 3 teams to be encouraged by. And, let's not forget about DePaul. I mean, DePaul's got 3 kids in the middle of its lineup who might be 3 of the best kids in Passaic County: Delvin Rod, Isaias Hernandez, and Joey Rizzuto, Rizzuto being a returning state medalist. So, when you have 3 studs like that, obviously it doesn't make up for, all 14 weight classes, but those are 3 kids whose names I think you're going to be seeing a lot of going forward.
And they also had a nice win over Passaic Valley as well. DePaul did.
Yeah, that's what I thought Jake went to. He ended up bringing it from home.
Another team that is continuing to wrestle well down in South Jersey is Lower Cape May. The Caper Tigers continue to climb in the NJ.com top 20, and they brought home another championship. They swept the Cinnaminson Duals in the final. They looked really good, a 51-15 victory over Wall. Also had wins over Woodstown and Raritan in there. And that brings up an interesting point as far as Group 2. You have Rumson-Fair Haven, the 2-time defending Group 2 state champions. We've been looking for a foil for the Bulldogs, the last couple years in that group. Lower Cape May looks like it's going to be that team so far. Rumson, still wrestling well despite some losses to some top teams, CBA and Southern, over the last 10 days. They had a relatively close match earlier in the season with Middle Township, 45-31 win for Rumson. What do you think, Joe? I mean, Lower Cape May has wrestled really well. They have one of the best wrestlers in the state in Chase Hansen, Tristan Rosemeyer also. It's a very strong lineup, 1 through 14. Can someone challenge Rumson in Group 2? And if there's going to be a challenger, is it Lower Cape May?
I don't think there's any question about it. And, Bill Evans, who couldn't be with us today, thinks exactly the same thing. He thinks they have enough lineup balance, enough depth to make a run at Rumson. Now, you and I saw Rumson last Friday night against Southern. And the one thing we will say about Rumson is they have 5 legitimate hammers who can put up bonus. So, I mean, we're talking Rumson's ability to score 25 to 30 points. The question is whether, Lower Cape May can win some of the toss-up bouts and put up some bonus of their own. And I think that state semifinal may actually be the final, just not at Rutgers, because I don't think there's any question that Lower Cape May is a viable challenger.
Correct. I completely agree with you on that. And just touching on Rumson again, having seen them in person, for me 3 times now so far, early this year, you can see exactly like you said, Joe, where Rumson is good. It's very good and can beat your best guys. The key for Rumson is going to be winning some of these toss-up bouts. They've shown the capability to do that. They're going to need to do that, in the biggest matches, as we get later and later in the year. Certainly, where they hope and plan to be at Jersey Mike's Arena in February. You can't count Rumson, anything but the favorite just because they've won 2 in a row and how loaded they are. But I think Lower Cape May certainly makes it interesting with the depth they have in the lineup.
And Bob, one of the places where Rumson has to get some points is at 20 with Eamon Fry. He lost 2-1 to Cade Collins. The other Fry in their lineup, Wyatt Fry, is a really wonderful addition. He's a terrific wrestler. And, one of the things that I think surprised me was, the way that Ryder Izzo and Luke Doherty gave him pins against Southern. And those are the kind of things they need to get if they are going to get past a Lower Cape May and back into the final.
Agreed. It's always the non-stars that make the difference in those huge dual meets. I mean, you're going to get what you expect from your big guns. It's those toss-up bouts that, determine championships. And, we're going to see, which teams can bring that to the forefront, during championship season. The top 20 had some fluctuation in it, as it usually does, from week to week. It'll have even more fluctuation in our updated one this coming Friday. But in our most recent one that was published on January 9th, we definitely had some movement in there. A team that we thought, might be on its way out if it didn't come around, answered the call. And, we weren't sure how that was going to go. Joe, hold on. I think Joe's trying to say something. Joe, you got something here?
Bob, wait a minute. Yeah, Phillipsburg. I came out, loud and proud last week that I thought they were a loss to North Hunterdon away from dropping out of the top 20. And okay, I was wrong. I put my foot in my mouth. But I have two things for the rabid Phillipsburg faithful. First, congratulations. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Second, you're welcome. I really feel like that I threw down the challenge at P-Berg and they responded, like the mythical, tremendous program that they are. However, I will say I think they have something to prove again this week, or they could see some droppage coming. Listen, they were handled by a very talented Southern team on Monday night, 44-25. Southern won 9 bouts. And, so next up for Phillipsburg is Watchung Hills. But the dual meet I have my eye on is the one on Friday against Delaware Valley at home. Again, I think if Delaware Valley can string together victories against North Hunterdon on Wednesday and Phillipsburg on Thursday, I think they're going to come flying into the top 20. And a P-Berg, a loss to Del Val, I think is going to drop the liners a little bit. I want to tell you, I didn't enjoy eating the crow because it certainly doesn't taste like chicken. But I still think the state liners, and let's face it, they wrestle one of the best schedules anywhere. There's nobody or no place P-Berg won't go. But, I still think, their status in the top 20, can change as next week goes on, Bob.
Completely agree. Yeah, they wrestle such a tough schedule where it's a little bit of a, a catch-22 where you have a lot of opportunity to move up if you beat those teams, but also that schedule is so challenging. You drop a couple of those, you're going to find yourself on the outside looking in. And they're certainly not the only team, in that scenario, but that's the way it is for Phillipsburg at the moment. You can see the potential there. I mean, are they at the height of their powers as they have been in recent years? I'd say no, right now, obviously looking at the results, but listen, it's still Phillipsburg.
Hey, Bob,
and to that end, I talked to Coach Tim Longacre after, their big win against North last week. And he said, they don't want to be doing their best wrestling right now. They want to save their best wrestling for February, for March. And that's why he put together such a tough schedule. I mean, obviously they have Easton, they're going down to Rumson on MLK Day. They have Immaculata in their division, but then they went and actively sought out a non-public school for the first time in over 15 years in Don Bosco. So, I think that speaks to, okay, they understand, they haven't had a state champ since boys state champ, since Brandon Hull in 2012. And I think, people are maybe starting to get a little restless and, especially after, making a team state final last year, losing to North Hunterdon for a second time last year, both by 10 points, feeling like, okay, a couple of bouts go their way. So I think this is a Phillipsburg team that's especially motivated. I think it's one that's wrestling well. And I think it's one that has a lot of good kids who know how to get the job done, know what the standard is there. And, do they have 14 kids who are going to be number one in every weight in our individual rankings? Maybe not, but they have a lot of tough kids who, if you're an opponent, you probably don't want to see.
Hey, Bob, still on the subject of top 20, one of the teams you and I cover, Middletown North, we popped them into the top 20 last week, and just like the Sports Illustrated jinx, they go out and lose a pair of matches to Seton Hall Prep, and then, what I really considered a large upset, they lose to rival Middletown South with a slam call in that match, maybe turning the tide of victory there. But I personally don't see Middletown North hanging in there, especially with like a Del Val and even an Old Bridge knocking on the door.
Certainly. I mean, 2 losses during the week, especially to unranked teams, is going to get you the boot. But, Middletown North is a team that, the strength is in dual meets for the Lions. They were close to winning the sectional title last season against eventual champion North Hunterdon. So those are definitely surprising losses. The one to Middletown South more so. I mean, Middletown South, that is a rivalry match. So, the whole cliche of you throw the records out the window and all that, I think that applies to a degree. I don't know if that applies as much in wrestling as does other sports, because it's essentially 14, contests inside of one. But you have to give credit to Middletown South there. They snapped a 4-match losing streak to their crosstown rival and got some big wins. The illegal slam call at 190 pounds certainly changed things. I look at that. I'm going to say that's at least a 10-point swing. And there were some other big pins in there by Middletown South that facilitated that upset. But for Middletown North, you're right. They're going to be out, more than likely once we get together and pick next week's top 20. They'll have opportunities to come back in. They wrestle a good schedule, but those opportunities might not come until later in the season.
Hey, Bob, and by the time wrestling fans get to see this, it doesn't get any easier for Middletown North. They're at Jackson Township, undefeated Jackson Township on Wednesday night, and on Tuesday night, I will be at Jackson again, Middletown South. So the Jags hosting a back-to-back day doubleheader against the Middletown programs.
Yeah, a chance for Middletown North to bounce back, and also a chance for Middletown South to continue making a statement. If they can take down the Jags, that's a team we might have to take a long, hard look at in the rankings. A team that we went back and forth on what to do with is Don Bosco Prep. The Ironmen suffered 4 losses, and usually that's going to get you the big heave-ho, but we have to consider who the Ironmen lost to. It was all top 20 teams. Ryan, what do you make of Don Bosco Prep right now, hanging on to that last spot at number 20 in our most recent rankings?
Yeah, so they got swept at that Pope John quad. Not that unexpected. I mean, they lost a very close duel against Pope John, but they lost on Wednesday. So when you see this, it'll be 8 days. They lost to St. Joe's in a match that was kind of closer than I thought it was going to be. They ended up being within single digits and then forfeited heavyweight to Christian Alvarez. Bosco has a schedule of the next couple matches where, they should be able to run the table. They got Pascack Valley coming up. I believe High Point's on that schedule as well. I would think they're going to run the table there, but then they get Bergen Catholic. I'm not going to hold it against them if they lose to Bergen Catholic on the 28th. But then they get RBC, they get P-Berg, like Jake and you guys mentioned. So they're going to have to win those matches to stay in the rankings. But like I said, I'm probably not going to hold it against them if they lose to Bergen Catholic in 2 weeks, but we'll see how that goes. We'll see where the rest of the rankings stack up. But, Bosco is kind of already in make or break mode. Like they got to, kind of walk the high wire these next couple matches, which I think they will. But at 4-4, like they're teetering on that Paramus Catholic range that they were in last year. Paramus Catholic went 9-8. If Bosco is losing some of these matches later in the month, into February, it could be what costs them. But like you said, Bob, we almost put them out. I vouched for them to stay in. I was one of the guys who vouched for them to stay in because those are 4 ranked losses. But we'll see how it shakes out for the Ironmen over the next couple weeks. They do have the Bergen County Tournament on Saturday, which we'll get to later in the episode. But yeah, already kind of make or break mode for the Ironmen.
And as always with the top 20, when teams falter, there's usually a handful of teams behind them just waiting for their chance to break into the top 20. We've got a few of those. Seton Hall Prep, we mentioned Seton Hall Prep. The Pirates had that nice win over Middletown North to put them in discussion. Jake, you also talked about Delaware Valley. Then Old Bridge is another team that has some impressive wins and could be a team that we take a look at once we get together and see who gets any of these open spots.
Yeah, so, obviously with Seton Hall Prep, the win over Middletown North is great. They had a nice, actually more than a pretty resounding win over longtime SEC American Division rival Caldwell after Caldwell beat them last year. And so I think Coach Lou Mascola's team is one that's wrestling well. They've wrestled at the Catholic Duel, so they've seen the likes of CBA and a lot of the, the state's top programs, but maybe just haven't quite broken through to, that upper echelon. And, they had a few kids who, missed weight against RBC. So that, of course, changes things a little bit. And, I think for them, they've got West Essex, they've got an ascendant Cedar Grove team coming up. So, they've got certainly their chance, if they can pick up some nice wins there and sort of reassert themselves atop the division and atop Essex County, I think that'll go a long way. Del Val, we've talked about pretty extensively here between all four of us. But the team, Bob, that you mentioned, I think is Old Bridge. Their John Post squad is 7-1 right now. Their only loss is to top 20 Phillipsburg team that is seemingly only getting better. It was by 7 points. It was 34-27. They beat Cranford, who's a perennial Group 3 contender. They beat Kingsway, who's a perennial Group 5 contender. They beat a Passaic Tech team that made a state semifinal last year. They beat Monroe in a rematch of last year's Central Group 5 final that Monroe won. So, they're checking all the boxes right now. They have a state-ranked wrestler, too. They have a couple of guys who are on the cusp. And, I think for them, they're wrestling Ridge on Wednesday when you hear this. I think that's going to be a great match, a great non-conference tool. I mean, Roy Dragon does a great job out in Basking Ridge there. And, so I think that's one that could decide, does Old Bridge get in? And then they've got St. Joe's Metuchen, they've got Howell, they've got Rumson, Southern. So they've really made it a point to beef up their schedule this year and show that, hey, Middlesex County wrestling, maybe we're not getting quite back to the days of Murderers Row and South Plainfield, but that there are definitely teams and kids, worth keeping an eye on. So I think those are sort of the three that have caught my attention, in the last week or so.
And then a dark horse candidate, I think we're going to take a look at more and more as the weeks go on, is Red Bank Catholic. And that might sound strange if you look at the KC's schedule and results. This is a team that lost its first 4 duels of the season. Usually those aren't going to be teams we're considering for the top 20, but the circumstances with RBC and waiting for a handful of transfers to be eligible to return, they still haven't had their full complement as they wait for heavyweight transfer Caden Sternlieb to be ready to go. That adds a state qualifier into their lineup, which will be another huge addition. Jake, you mentioned the win over Seton Hall Prep, even though the Pirates had some guys miss weight, still a quality win. So I think RBC is a team to keep an eye on. They've had some really good contributions, especially down low in the lineup. John Tarantino, the freshman, continues to put up impressive wins. He's 9-3 on the season. And they just have pretty good depth. There's not a lot of holes, certainly not too many back-to-back weights where they're not strong. So RBC is a team that I think we look at as the season goes on and they get a little stronger. The question with RBC is going to be, do they have the opportunities? They had a pretty front-loaded schedule where they didn't have the full complement of guys. They had a close loss to Rumson-Fair Haven, without most of their transfers. So I think RBC, the jury's still out. They're close. Once Sternlieb comes back at heavyweight and we see them in a high-quality duel, I think we'll get a good idea if RBC is a team that we want to take a look at potentially putting into the top 20 in the coming weeks.
Hey, Bob, and a couple teams we would be remiss not talking about with Bill not being with us. One is Kingsway. However, Kingsway was beaten by Old Bridge 38-34 on Saturday, so that may hurt their chances a little bit. But another one I think is Washington Township, wrestling very well out of South Jersey. I know this. I believe they have Delsea this week, so that'll be a match to watch. And I think Washington Township is another team that we're going to have to consider when we talk later this week.
Certainly. The Minutemen haven't wrestled. They haven't had that challenging duel that makes you take notice that they win, but they're 8-0, and they have a match with Delsea, and then looking ahead to January 21st, they wrestle at Kingsway. So that will be a big one in South Jersey. A little bit of a separation match coming later on in the month. Individual rankings, we went through our second edition of those, which thankfully were a lot easier than that initial one. Some movement all around, some notable ones we'll get to. When we were going through and we got up to 215 pounds, Ryan, you took a look at that and you said, wow, this is probably the deepest weight in the state, and it's loaded. And the more I looked at it, the more I had to agree. I mean, that's a weight class where, the top 6 guys, really all 8 guys, are really strong and, are candidates to be high on the podium. That's going to be a fun weight class to watch as the season continues.
Yeah, and Bill was mentioning it too, because Bill's got 2 of his kids in there, in Sal Marchese and Anthony Jackson. He's also got, Wheeler in there as well. He's been a stud. But, it starts with Dante DeLuca up top, right? He's the runner-up at this weight to Anthony Harris last year. Anthony Harris is now graduated. And then you get into Sal Marchese, just going in order of our rankings. Nico Gonzalez, who lost to Marchese in the Robin Left final. And then you got kids like Rocco Salerno, who was a Beast of the East finalist. Tyler Palumbo, who did beat Rocco Salerno at the Catholic Duals. He's flashed a lot of potential there for CBA. He also beat Anthony Jackson at the Beast in a match that was awesome. Anthony Jackson was winning, and then Palumbo got late points there to win. Levi Foote, I mentioned Jackson Wheeler. This is a fantastic weight. Anything can happen at this weight. That's how I see it. And Dante DeLuca has been outstanding. He missed some time to start the year, getting back from a couple of football, nicks and bruises, stuff like that. But he's been on the scene since he was a freshman. He's been teching and decking just about everyone. And he kind of reminds me of the new Vincenzo Laval, who has a lot of state medals and a runner-up and is just so close to winning a state title. Like, that's the next notch off his belt. 2 Florham Park kids, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, DeLuca might be the favorite. But like I said, just a lot that could happen at this weight. You already have some head-to-head, so going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Hey, good Bob, comparison with LaValle. I like that.
Hey, Bob, and we talked to Dan Roy after the Rumson match last week, and he kind of mentioned the possibility that Levi doesn't even go 215 in the postseason.
He weighs in at about 194 pounds for all of their dual meets. So yeah, I mean, knowing Southern's history of having their wrestlers, suck down some weight, to get in position for team, 4 or 5 pounds is nothing. He should be in good shape to do that if he wants to.
And he is going to go, what is it, 189 in Pennsylvania, 190?
189 for the Escape the Rock.
189 for Escape the Rock. And Dan Roy said, they're going to let him get down to that, and they're going to see how comfortable he feels. And, something I'll talk about a little later in this broadcast, but he gave away 74 pounds the other night and beat the Rumson heavyweight. So I really think he will have absolutely no trouble with 89 and 90 pounders, Bob.
Completely agree. Another weight that we've talked about a bunch, but I'm going to talk about it again because every time I look at it, this is going to be fun. And that's 106 pounds. And that's typically the case because that's where most of the freshmen are in that lower weight. And, it's the same this year. In our top 8, we have 1 sophomore, 1 junior, and the rest are freshmen. And this is an impressive list. Santino Edgar from CBA, Jonas Lusker from Southern, Caden Wadle from North Hunterdon, Finn Anderson, Del Barton, Thomas Blewett, the elder statesman from Middletown North as a junior. And then, the freshman Stephen Bogosius, Camden Catholic, Ryan Hall from Bergen Catholic, and John Tarantino from RBC. And there's kids that are not ranked right now that there's a good chance they're going to have a say, as far as the top 8 in the state goes once we get to Atlantic City. I really have no idea what's going to happen to that weight. We have our rankings, certainly, of who we feel is wrestling the best right now, but I think that's going to be exciting. I think kids that we peg as state championship contenders, they could be losing in, regions, districts, who knows, depending on what the matchups are. And I think that bracket could be all over the place. I think that bracket, when we get to Atlantic City, might have the best quarterfinal matchups of anyone, just because, you have kids with no criteria, so they could end up, in any place. And I'm always checking the 106 results just to see what's going on, because I think that's going to be extremely exciting.
Yeah, no doubt. You might have even good round of 16 matchups, but
Yeah.
yeah, Joe, you mentioned 190 and Levi Foote. I mean, that's a tough decision because 190 might be just as good as 215. You know, if you look at our indie ranks, Tanner Hodgins, he's one of the top pound for pound kids in the state, I would say. You see what he did, you know, on the world level. I mean, he's fantastic. CJ Betts has had a really good start to the season. He's kind of, you know, become a national presence there at 190. And then Nevin Matisich, multiple state medals. He's had a great start to the year. Really hasn't gotten scored on a whole lot. Alex Reyes, the Rutgers commit, he comes in at 4 in our indie ranks, and he's looked really good. And then you have Jaden Simpson is a state medalist. Luke Doherty has had a good start to the season. He made waves last week. I believe he pinned Brock Oswitz, if I'm not mistaken. Tornik Kajaya is a guy I know you guys love, and Carmen Moreno's also had a very good start to the year. I don't believe he's lost in state at 190. So 190 is just as tough as 215, if, you know, in my opinion. So Levi Foote has a very interesting decision to make.
That's a very good point, Ryan, because you got to pick what do you think the best path is for the state tournament. I don't know this for a fact. Dan Roy or Levi Foote haven't said anything, but to me, I think that I would think Foote would go 215 for the postseason, but be down at 190 to give Southern that flexibility, really with him, that ultra flexibility, because he's shown, you know, he's been weighing in around 195, let's say. For him to get down, especially with the allowance of what it could be, for him to get down to be eligible to wrestle at 190, he's already shown he can go up to heavyweight and give up 50, 60, 70 pounds and win and get bonus points at heavyweight. So that versatility where you could have him at 3 weight classes in dual meets is exceptional. But I think individually, it just looks like 215 would be the best spot for him. At 150, we have a new wrestler in the weight class, and that's a returning state medalist. Back on the mat for the first time this year after transferring to Immaculata. That's Rhett Wyszleski, the senior. That's a big addition. You know, Jake, that shakes up the rankings a little bit. Wyszleski finally, you know, on the mat after transfer from Hunter and Central. What do we think there at 150? That's another weight where we could see some change. Sonny Amato, number 1. Does he go down? Does he stay there? There's some intrigue at that weight already. And then Wyszleski, you know, adds a little bit more now that he's back.
Yeah, you know, and, you know, he left Flemington with a chance to become Hunter and Central's all-time winningest wrestler. That's obviously now not going to happen. And, you know, so he's suiting up now for Rodney Van Ness and Immaculata. And, you know, he's one of several high-profile transfers they brought in, one of several Hunter and Central transfers that they brought in. And, yeah, you know, anytime you add a returning state medalist to the field and to the mix, you know, the rising tide sort of lifts all boats, and that weight class just gets better and better. And, you know, we have him ranked 7th this year, or to start this week, excuse me, you know, based on his 7th place finish last year. But, you know, given who Immaculata wrestles, given, you know, the track record that Rhett has, you know, to see him climb up the rankings and to do it soon wouldn't be a surprise, you know, in any stretch of the imagination. And, you know, I think that that's a weight too where, you know, it's got a lot of, you know, interesting names in it. Obviously, Sonny Amato, yes. But, you know, you look at Jackson Weller from Delran, who, you know, is ranked nationally and has made a name for himself. You know, Joey Petriello from Dumont has, you know, an impressive win over Nick Barone, who's ranked. You know, Michael Kraft for Camden Catholic is another one of those kids in the lineup who maybe doesn't get, you know, the same level of recognition of Sammy Spalding or Cage Jones, but it's just as integral to what, you know, Coach Bill Heverly is trying to do down there. So, yeah, you know, I think that this is a weight where, for as much as, you know, we might think the top spot is a foregone conclusion, Sonny Amato also lost last year in the state tournament to Blaze Mealy from Princeton. So, you know, while he's got the number 1 spot now, I think the addition of a guy like Wyszleski and, you know, some of these other names that we're keeping an eye on, I think definitely add, you know, a level of intrigue here.
Certainly agree with that, Jake. You know, wrestlers that impressed us, that's what we're going to talk about next. Again, like there's so much talent in this state. I think every week you can go through and pick out, you know, 5 or 10 guys that are turning heads. You know, we touched on a little bit in our individual rankings, but, you know, I'm going to go first here. You know, wrestler that has had an excellent year and has put himself in consideration to be a state championship contender is Tom Jarrett's Ricky DeLorenzo. DeLorenzo was 4th in the state last season, 27-4 after missing a little bit of time early. And he has come out this year, and you can see he's jumped levels. He has one loss in New Jersey, and that was to Pope John's Dalton Weber in the 3rd round of the Beast of the East. But he came back and he beat Weber in the finals of the Sam Cali to win that title. This past week he went 4-0 with 4 pins, and he's been carrying the heavy load down low for a Toms River East team that's had some nice wins early in the year and had some good upsets when it's had its full complement of the lineup. So right now, you look at, and this is a caveat because you don't know what this weight class is going to look like, in totality. But you look at 132 pounds right now. We have Anthony DeAndre from Watchung Hills ranked number 1, DeLorenzo 2. You go down Colton Hagerty from Washington Township, Sal Barametti, PJ Terranova from Del Barton, Aiden Yarusi from North Hunterdon, and then Weber and St. Joe's Mikey Batista. That's a pretty wide open weight class. Now, the caveat there, as I mentioned, is Sammy Spalding of Camden Catholic is at 138. There's a chance he drops to 132 at some point. Maybe he doesn't, and maybe 132 stays that way. If Spalding were to go down, I think he's the clear favorite at 132. But as it stands right now, DeLorenzo is a championship contender. And Toms River East has not had a state champion since the great Vinny Delafav, the 2-time state champ, who's now an assistant coach at CBA. And DeLorenzo, he's just wrestled so well. Every time, I look at the results, he's picking up another impressive win. And, that win over Weber, avenging that loss, really put him back on track. And he's looking incredibly strong and looking forward to see what he can do the rest of the season.
Yeah, I got to see that loss from Weber at the Sam Cali in the final there. And I mentioned DeLorenzo, I believe it was on the last podcast or maybe the podcast before that, but he gets my seal of approval. He's been outstanding for Toms River East, and you just see the leap that it looks like he can make. State 4th, all of a sudden he's a kid who could win a state title in our opinion. So, kudos to Ricky DeLorenzo. The kid I wanted to touch on was Joe Rowinski from Hackettstown, giving more love to the HWS land. And really just talk about Hackettstown as a whole, because, both Rowinski and Hackettstown are really cool stories this year. Rowinski won his 2nd HWS title on Saturday. Last year, he beat Caden Wadle in the 106-pound final. This year, it was Anthony Pettinelli he beat from Peaburg at 120. And I got the chance to speak with him after the tournament, along with his teammate, Steven Vidal, who made the 106-pound final against Wadle this year. And I also spoke with first-year head coach Tyler Cosimer, who took over for Jim Barringer this year. And it's another year where, I just sit back and I'm very impressed with, Rowinski and his ability to fend off shots and turn them into takedowns of his own, which he did throughout the tournament. And I think that if there weren't 6 state medalists in our Indy ranks at 120, he might have a shot at being ranked. And that's just a loaded weight where even with Sans and Burke, and by the way, Burke's not even in our rankings now because he's been out a couple weeks. When he's healthy, 7 state medalists in those rankings, that's a weight where you think a lot of kids would be fleeing, but, a lot of kids are in those rankings right now, and there's just not enough room for Rowinski, but he's shown that he's a kid who might belong in there eventually, and he's shown that he could be a leader for his team. Hackettstown 20 years ago was real good. They won back-to-back sections, and these lower weights for them are some of their more experienced wrestlers. They're doing the coaching down low and in the middle of the lineup, while Cosimer and the rest of his staff are kind of bringing along the young and inexperienced upper weights. So, Hackettstown all of a sudden is becoming a story. They're 6-1. They beat up on Kittatinny. When did you think you were going to say that anytime soon with how good Kittatinny's been over the last several decades? A lot of these kids are juniors, but and one of them is Rowinski. If these kids come along later this year into next year, we could be talking about a very special Hackettstown team, but we'll see. It's a very tough group. I could see them maybe next year wrestling High Point. Gym's packed and it's getting interesting, but we'll see. That we have ways to go before that happens, even this year. So, Hackettstown is very much trending up, and Rowinski is a big reason why.
Z, you had your foot in your mouth earlier. You took it out and got a different kind of foot to talk about. One who I know has really impressed you, and we talked about Levi Foote already, but I know he's a wrestler that, especially when you saw him in that match against Rumson, just what he's done all year has been something that's caught your eye.
Without question, Bob. Like I said, I mentioned a little earlier, we saw him go out against the Rumson heavyweight, who was really, really big. He was giving away 74 pounds. And the other thing that was so cool to watch was how intelligently he wrestled. He attacked without being reckless. He got a couple of takedowns. And the most important thing he did, he never gave the Rumson kid a chance to be on top, to have all that weight on top of him. Levi is 13-1. 10 of those wins are at 215. 3 are at 285. But the other thing is how clutch he's been. So what are we in the second week of January? He's already had 3 wins that either gave Southern the victory or turned the tide or started a rally. He had the decisive win against North Hunterdon. He gave up 40 or 50 pounds against Mount Olive, Martini, and, won a close bout there that, helped Southern win. And then to beat this Rumson kid, and we were in that gym, that place was going crazy because, Rumson had thrown together 2 pins and, made it a close match. And he just came out and quieted the crowd. I call him the comeback snuffer. So he's just been very impressive to me. And, he's obviously going to be a big player in Southern's attempt to win the 3rd Group 5, Bob.
And real quick with Foote, just his versatility, be able to compete and wrestle at 3 weights up top, while weighing in, low, has been huge for Southern. Talking to head coach Dan Roy after the victory over Phillipsburg on Monday, and the match was in hand by the time Foote came out and won and pinned at 215. But just that ability to move him around and have him be that chess piece, has been important. And Howells Tanner Hodgins has done the same thing, for the Rebels. He's a 190 pounder, but he's weighed in at 215. He's gone up to heavyweight and picked up some big wins. So yeah, when you have that kind of versatility anywhere in the lineup, that's going to be a big boost to your team's, potential to win dual meets. It gives you the option to just counter opposing teams' lineups in ways that few other teams can.
Yeah, and obviously I have a wrestler who caught my attention, not because I think he's going to be, necessarily a state medalist, a state ranked kid anytime soon, but just sort of based on improbability. And Joe wrote about this match, but Caldwell wrestled Hanover Park, who made a Group 1 final last year, and they've wrestled each of the last 2 years. It's been a close match every year. They beat him by 4 last year. They beat him by 6 this year. And the reason was, Caldwell trotted out Teagan McOmish, who's a career football player. He's a fullback and defensive end for Caldwell's pretty vaunted football team at 190 pounds, and came in, hadn't won a bout all season, in a hostile environment, home gym, everybody's rowdy against a storied program, and he gets a win and basically seals it for Caldwell in the process, and sort of establishes himself as a wrestler. And Caldwell's a team, they went 24-2 last year. They were super competitive with Rumson in the state final. They had some losses to graduation and transfer at the upper weights, and for as good as they are down low, I think there were some questions coming in this year about what they had up top and what could they get. But, having a kid like McOmish, Bob, you said before that so many of these big time marquee duels are decided at the margins and kind of by the less heralded kids. I think this was a great example of that. And, if you want to read more about it, check out Joe's story, because it was great. It paints the scene really well. And, it just goes to show that kind of any given day, any given night, any one of these kids could step up and make a name for themselves.
And on that topic, on McOmish and Joe's story that you wrote, the part I love was a wrestler was born. This sport is hard. It's really hard. It's hard for the kids that do it on a year-round basis. For the kids that are in-season wrestlers, and trying to for the first time or young in their wrestling journey, it can be very discouraging. But then you see when that bug has bit them, they get a big win. They're part of that, a huge team moment. And that kind of sets the tone for them going forward. And we've seen that a lot of times throughout our careers. I know all of us have. So pretty special moment there for Caldwell and McOmish, and we'll see how that plays out going forward. Moving on to what's coming up this weekend. Again, we're on to county and conference tournament seasons. There's also a huge tournament, on the other side of the river in Pennsylvania, Council Rock High School South, the annual Escape the Rock tournament. 21 New Jersey teams, 9 of which are in the top 20. Number 3 CBA, number 4 Camden Catholic, number 6 St. Joe's, number 7 Southern, number 9 Delsea, 10 Howell, 12 Pope John, 15 Mount Olive, and 17 Lower Cape May, also Blair Academy, and several other New Jersey schools. So this is always a good one. What I'm looking forward to most is some matchups that we haven't seen yet that we could potentially see in this tournament. The pre-seeds are out for the Escape the Rock. Those aren't final yet, so there could be some movement there, but just based on the information we have so far, really some potential interesting matchups. You could see Santino Edgar of CBA against Southern's Jonas Lusker at 106. That could be a quarterfinal bout there. Killian Coluccio of Lacey, he's the number 2 seed at 114. If the seeds hold, he could wrestle Malvern's Justin Farnsworth in the final. Farnsworth, the number 2 seed. You also have St. Joe's Charles Esposito, CBA's Shiloh Joyce there at 114. Coluccio and Joyce, that could be a quarterfinal bout. 121, Jonathan McGinty of St. Joe's, the number 5 seed. Like, can McGinty get his mojo back after struggling a little bit? There's just some really good wrestling that we should see between New Jersey, opponents here. 215, that weight class is so deep. You have Sal Marchese of Delsea. He's the 3 seed. Nico Gonzalez, the 4 seed. Tyler Palumbo, 6th. Rocco Salerno, 7th. Anthony Jackson, 11th. You could have a rematch between Palumbo and Jackson in the quarterfinals. 145, the top 5 seeds are all top 10 kids, in the country, with CBA's Bobby Duffy coming in at the number 5 seed. So, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff going on at Escape the Rock, and those are brackets I'm going to be really checking furiously this weekend just to see, how it shakes out and if we have some matchups that are going to affect our rankings going forward.
Yeah, no doubt. And what's interesting is McGinty's at 120. I had a feeling that could happen because, JoJo Burke is out for the time being. He's got the broken hand. So maybe McGinty getting down to a weight he's more comfortable. Remember, he wanted to wrestle. He wrestled Burke for the 120 spot, didn't win it. Maybe this is what he needs to, get his mojo back, like you said, Bob. He's at a weight where he's more comfortable, and maybe this is what he needs to get out of this little bit of a funk he's in. I have faith that he's going to. I mean, he's a 2-time state finalist. He's a pretty darn good wrestler no matter where he wrestles. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. St. Peter's is also not at the Escape the Rock tournament for the first time in a while. So, Coach Verdi taking a different route this year. I know he's also a little banged up, so maybe it's a blessing in disguise they're not there. I think Paparo is going to end up being okay. He medically forfeited out of his matches at the Doc Buchanan after reaching the semifinals. I know Joey Ruiz is not 100% yet. He did wrestle very well at the Doc, but I know that he's a little banged up. So they're not at 100%, so maybe that's a blessing. But what I wanted to talk about here is the Bergen County Tournament, and I think that this is a very interesting field this year because you're going to have Paramus Catholic there in full. You're going to have Don Bosco there in full. Bergen Catholic is also going to be there in full. So I'm looking forward to finally a year where there's not, it's not a watered down field. You do have St. Joe's Montvale not there. Obviously, they're going to be at Escape the Rock. It conflicts. Garfield Middle School as well, a very good venue. I know, Jake, you come down there with me usually, so it's a very good venue there. Very underrated venue, and maybe one that sticks for a little bit. And I think one of the more interesting storylines every year is what public school kids can pick off the non-public kids for titles. There's usually 1 or 2 every year. It might be a little tougher this year with all 3 of those schools there in full. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. You mentioned Joey Petriello, Jake. He's a kid who's impressed me a lot to start the year. He's got a head-to-head win over Nick Barone. Like you mentioned, Luke Stemkowski has beaten Joey Ruiz. He's a kid for Pascack Valley. One of their headliners, Jacob and Sarah, was at Don Bosco, has showed himself a little bit. Last year, Charlie Shadow, who graduated from Ridgewood now, but he beat Harry Asatrian. So like I said, things happen here every year. And this is also going to be 2 days after Paramus Catholic wrestles Bergen Catholic on Thursday. So when you see this on Thursday, we're going to be hours out from Paramus Catholic versus Bergen Catholic in a duel. John Piella, who, I can't believe he's been there that long at Paramus Catholic, is going to wrestle for win number 200 against his alma mater. I would peg Paramus Catholic as a slight underdog in that match, but who knows? And what a storyline that would be. Imagine John Piella getting win number 200 against his alma mater in a match where I'm not picking them to win. I know a lot of people aren't picking them to win, but Paramus Catholic has started the year pretty hot. So maybe this is their signature moment, the year where they say, you know what, we're here. Like we can do this. We are very much in play in non-public A. So we'll see what happens, but it's going to be a very fun couple of days here in Bergen County.
And then going south and a little bit west, we'll have the Somerset County Tournament and then also the Union County Tournament. Jake, that's your area. We'll start in Somerset. What are you looking forward to, out there during that county tournament this weekend?
Yeah, so, obviously Watchung Hills comes in as the defending champs. They've won 3 titles since 2018 or 19, I think it is. They have a newish coach at the helm, Danny Smith. He was the coach there for 20-something years, led them to 300 wins, took 7 years off, led them to their only section titles in program history, or their first section title, in program history. He's back now this year. He's got, again, one of the best wrestlers in the state pound for pound, Anthony DeAndrea, who's trying to become win his 4th Somerset County title, and I think is probably the odds-on favorite to do it. The real team I think to watch this year is Immaculata. With the transfers they brought in, they had 3 champs last year. They put some more guys in the finals, and their guys have shown they can be gotten to and can be beaten. We had Forrest Rose, who transferred in from Princeton, ranked last week. He got pinned by a kid from Robbinsville, Alex Vecito, in a duel. Again, in the finals, they weren't perfect in the finals last year, but I think adding that firepower and adding kids who are going to get you points in those wrestleback matches, in those consolation matches, in those medal matches is only going to bode well for them. So I think Immaculata is certainly probably maybe the team to watch. But Ridge too. Ridge has a lineup that has 4 state qualifiers in it. They return a county champ in Tanner Connolly. Hillsborough, no team in the last 5 years, I think, has had more champs than Coach Reese Weinberger's group, I think they're averaging 2 or 3 champs a year, which is pretty impressive. So, for as much as the team race might be, a little bit of a foregone conclusion, I think there will still be some standout individuals. And I'd be remiss, too, if I didn't mention Manville, who's off to an 11-0 start, has a bunch of kids wrestling really well. Pat Gorbatuk said, a lot of his kids are young, so they might not be seated super well because they only have 1 kid or 2 kids in their lineup with region advancement criteria, but that he likes the way they're wrestling. They're wrestling tough. He's sort of helped to elevate that program and its standards. So I think this will kind of be the first big test and the big chance that they'll have to show that. And then in Union County, Cranford, as crazy as it sounds to believe, there might not be a team in the state that has, had reign of its area more than the Cougars and Coach Pat Cortman. They've won 10 straight Union County titles. Last year, it was actually a fairly close team race. It wasn't, a foregone conclusion. And, this year, I think it's hard to handicap. They lose Jordan Chapman, who's arguably the best wrestler in program history, or certainly one of the most electric kids. But, they still have Michael Daly, who's a state medalist. They have Luke Schultz at 150, who's good. They have other guys there who know how to win and can win in big spots. But this is a team where, I think there are more questions than there have been in the past. And I think if you look at their dual meet results, it sort of bears that out. So, I think some other teams I'm keeping an eye on here. Rahway has 4 state qualifiers in its lineup, and Dan Gary has them wrestling very well. Westfield is always a tough out. Jake Zemsky hasn't wrestled yet at 190. He's a returning state medalist. If we see him in the tournament, that certainly gives the Blue Devils a big boost. Braden Valley from a tiny Group 1 school like New Providence. He's a 2-time county champ. So, I think that there's a lot of intrigue this year in terms of, okay, if it's Cranford, is it going to be by a wide margin? But is it going to be Cranford? And I think, we don't know that yet. So I'll be there on Saturday. But yeah, I think in kind of Western and Central Jersey, I think it's a good weekend. So,
Jake, what about Union?
Oh yeah, well in Union too. I mean, they're wrestling very well. I mean, they're 10-1. Their only losses to Nutley. Dino DiBelloni has elevated that program. He's sent kids to Atlantic City each of the last few years. That snapped like a 7-8 year drought. They had two county champs last, or they had one county champ last year, one the year before. That snapped a long drought too. So yeah, they're kids that are pesky and going to make life tough for a lot of kids. So, I think that's going to be one of the more exciting tournaments of the weekend.
And then lastly, some big girls wrestling tournaments coming up this weekend. We have the Queen of the Hill duels. That'll be at Morris Hills. Some of the top teams in the state will be there, led by Jackson Township, the #1 girls team in the state. On Sunday, we'll have the Greater Middlesex Conference Tournament. That'll be at Churchill Middle School in East Brunswick. Also, the Ladies Spartan Jamboree at Immaculata. And then on Monday, it'll be the Shore Conference Tournament at Jackson Township. Our great girls wrestling reporter, Mike Holcomb, he'll have coverage for all three on NJ.com. I think we're going to try to have Mike on next week, considering all these big, girls wrestling tournaments coming up, and just get the lay of the land from Mike, talk about some of the top storylines in the girls wrestling scene, some of the big upsets, and, some of the changes that we're going to see come tournament time as far as the girls team states, districts, regions, and all that going forward. So looking to having Mike on, and we'll keep an eye on those big girls tournaments this coming weekend. That's going to do it for us here on episode 4 of Weighing In. Always a great conversation with these gentlemen here. A lot to talk about every week and a lot to look forward to. And we're excited to talk wrestling each and every week here on NJ.com. So for Joe Zedalis, Ryan Patti, Jake Aferiat, I'm Bob Batters saying thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on NJ.com.